Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to look past, the usual jobs reports and CPI data. We're focusing on one single source of risk that right now is pretty much overriding everything else, and that's the constitutional crisis that seems to be brewing at the Federal Reserve.
It's a huge deal. And our sources on this, especially a really deep analysis from Friednoven's Global Review, they make it incredibly clear.
Right. So yes, the U.S. economy has its problems, stubborn inflation, huge structural shifts from AI, new tariffs, but that's not the main story.
Not right now. The single biggest thing shaping the 2026 outlook is the institutional risk. Specifically, this Department of Justice criminal investigation that's targeting Fed Chair Jerome Powell himself.
So our mission today is to connect those dots, to draw a straight line from this unprecedented political standoff to the macroeconomic forecast. We need to figure out what happens to the whole global economy and, to your own financial health when a central bank's independence is suddenly and so openly under siege.
And what's so striking here is the language the sources are using. It's not just to talk about political instability. They're using terms normally saved for emerging markets.
What do you mean by that?
Central bank independence is, it's the bedrock of how advanced economies work. It's how you manage inflation, how you keep a currency stable. And the warning in the analysis is explicit. It says these actions, this direct pressure, it looks a lot like how monetary policy gets made in emerging markets with weak institutions. That's how serious the institutional decay is that we now have to price in.
Okay, let's get into the anatomy of this crisis first. We're calling it the Eccles standoff, after the Fed's historic Eccles building where all this is centered. So what are the specific legal moves being made against Chair Powell right now?
So the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia is leading it. It's a criminal probe, and the big move was serving grand jury subpoenas on January 10th.
And what are they officially investigating?
The technical focus is Powell's testimony to Congress. It's about a huge $2.5 billion renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. And the allegation is that he gave false or misleading testimony about how big that project was and what it would ultimately cost.
That sounds very technical, almost designed to be confusing, but Powell's response was not technical at all. Do you think he had any other choice but to just escalate this into the public sphere?
He clearly felt he didn't. In a move that is just completely unprecedented, he released a video statement a day after getting the subpoena. He didn't use the usual legal channels. He went straight to the public and called the threats politically motivated pressure.
And he said it was to force his hand on interest rates.
Exactly. He said the administration was unhappy with the Fed's policy, and this was their way of trying to coerce him into cutting rates. By doing that, he turned it from a legal issue into an existential fight over the Fed's autonomy. It was a massive institutional counterpunch.
And this isn't an isolated incident, which is crucial here. The sources point to a really clear systematic pattern of targeting the Fed's voting board.
That's right. You have to look at the parallel DOJ investigation into Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. That's been going on since September 2025.
And she's a consistent voter with Powell, right?
A reliable ally for him on policy, yes. And she's facing these allegations of mortgage fraud that supposedly happened years before she was even appointed in 2022. Her legal team is arguing it's just political harassment, that it's designed to change the board's voting makeup by forcing her out.
So wait, if you have the executive branch investigating the sitting chair and a sitting governor, and then you have the Supreme Court about to weigh in on this, does that give the president a blueprint to just dismantle Fed independence?
That is the absolute core fear here. The Supreme Court is set to hear arguments on January 21st in Trump v. Cook. The case is specifically about the president's power to remove a governor for cause, based on these pre-appointment allegations. If the court defines for cause really broadly, so that it could include, minor past issues or even just policy disagreements, then it creates a permanent weapon for presidential control. It would gut the Fed's independence. The fact that Powell and Cook are being targeted at the same time suggests it's a coordinated strategy.
Wow. Okay, so given how serious that threat is, the backlash has been really fast and, surprisingly, bipartisan. You don't see that very often these days.
No, you don't. And that just shows you how threatened the institutional guardrails feel. Just yesterday, we saw a joint statement condemning the whole thing. It came from a coalition of 13 former Fed chairs and Treasury secretaries. We're talking people who rarely agree on anything.
Like who?
Yellen, Bernanke, Alan Greenspan, Henry Paulson. Bernanke and Greenspan signing the same letter as Janet Yellen. That's the financial establishment sounding a five-alarm fire.
That is a huge unity signal. And what Yellen said was particularly striking.
It really was. She knows Powell. She knows how the Fed and Treasury work inside and out. And she called the situation extremely chilling.
Hmm.
And then she said, flat out, the odds that he would have lied are zero. She's putting aside all politics to defend the institution itself. It's a sign this goes way beyond a simple policy fight.
And this isn't just statements and condemnation. We're seeing actual concrete roadblocks being put up in Congress now.
Precisely. Republican Senator Tom Tillis, who is a very important member of the Senate Banking Committee, he put out a statement vowing to block all Trump administration nominees to the Fed, every single one, until this investigation is resolved. In a narrowly divided Senate, that creates an immediate procedural wall. It basically makes it impossible for the administration to fill any vacancies on the board.
Okay, so that's the institutional chaos, the political firestorm. But let's not forget, the Fed still has a day job. What was the U.S. economy actually looking like before this all exploded?
Well, it's a complicated picture. The blue chip consensus for 2026 GDP growth is kind of middling, around 1.9%. But the range of forecasts is huge. Some are seeing a stall at 1.2%, others are seeing a pretty robust 2.5%. That kind of spread tells you just how uncertain things are.
But there are some strong positive forces at play, which is why we're not really seeing recession forecasts yet. Where's the growth coming from?
Two main engines, really. The first is fiscal stimulus from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the OBBB. That's front-loaded to pump about $200 billion into the economy early this year.
Which is what, about 0.6% of GDP?
Right, and the second engine is just massive investment in artificial intelligence infrastructure. That's still going strong. The source estimates it added half a percentage point to GDP growth just in 2025.
But even with that AI-fueled growth, the labor market is starting to look shaky. The sources talk about a jobless growth risk. The unemployment number is holding steady around 4.4, 4.6%. So how is the Fed supposed to manage this kind of K-shaped pain that's hitting certain sectors so hard?
That's the million-dollar question for them. Job creation has slowed way down. We're only seeing about 50 or 55,000 jobs a month on average. The GDP number looks okay because of all this AI capital investment, not because everyone's getting hired. And we're seeing this structural dislocation from AI. It's flattening demand for routine white-collar jobs. Think admin staff, data entry, junior financial analysts. So you have the top of the K doing great with GDP, while the middle and bottom of the labor market are really hurting.
Which makes the Fed's dual mandate of stable prices and maximum employment almost impossible to achieve. You can't fix both with one interest rate. So if the labor market is getting softer, why is inflation still a problem? Shouldn't they be cutting rates?
Because the inflation isn't coming from an overheating economy. It's coming from structural supply shocks, mainly tariffs. Core PCE inflation is still stuck above that 2% target. CPI is at 2.7% year over year. The Fed's hands are tied. If they cut rates to help the labor market, they'll make the tariff inflation even worse.
And this is where we get to probably the most explosive detail of all, something Powell himself said.
It's an incredible moment of institutional pushback. He said publicly in December that tariffs were responsible for the entirety of inflation's rise above the 2% target in 2025. He's basically using the Fed's platform to point the finger directly at the administration's trade policy. He's saying, you are the reason we can't do our job on prices. That kind of public clash is just extraordinary.
And it's not an abstract problem for people. That cost is hitting consumers directly right now. It's a tax hike.
A massive one. The tariff regime brought in an extra $187 billion in revenue in 2025. The source notes that's the largest tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993. And when you break it down, it's an estimated tax increase of about $1,400 per U.S. household this year. This is real money from real family budgets.
Okay, so let's tie this all back to the institutional crisis. The Fed funds rate is at 3.5 to 3.75%. What kind of impossible situation does this DOJ investigation create for their upcoming January meeting?
It creates an extreme policy paradox. The sources say the investigation likely precludes rate cuts, because any move to ease policy right now would be seen as capitulation, as giving in to political pressure. The market would immediately assume the DOJ probe worked.
Wait, so you're saying in an economy where job growth is weak and growth is just okay, the Fed might actually hold rates firm or even hike, not because of the data, but because of politics. That seems completely backward.
It is backward, but it's a defense mechanism. The sources suggest this whole crisis could paradoxically force the FOMC to be more hawkish than the data would suggest. They have to put their institutional credibility first. They have to prove they are independent. Right now, defending that credibility is more important than fine-tuning policy for the short-term economy.
This brings us to the biggest question. How do you even price this? How do investors and economists forecast not based on GDP, but on political resilience?
You have to switch to scenario analysis. That's the only way. The base case scenario assumes the guardrails hold. The investigation fizzles, the institution survives, and we see moderate growth of maybe 2.0 to 2.3%. The 10-year Treasury goes in a normal range, say 4.0 to 4.3%. That's the bet that the American system, as strained as it is, will ultimately function.
Yeah, but then there's the other side of that coin, the severe stress scenario. What happens if the administration actually succeeds in removing Powell and Cook, and they install people who will just cut rates on demand no matter what inflation is doing?
That is the stagflationary nightmare scenario. It's where the loss of confidence drives everything. In that world, real GDP growth collapses to almost zero, maybe 0.5 to 1.8%. Yeah. But at the same time, core PCE inflation surges to 3.2, maybe 3.8%. You get the worst of both worlds, slow growth and high inflation, because inflation expectations become completely unanchored. Once people stop trusting the central bank, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And the market reaction would be brutal. Tell me about this sovereign risk spike. A 75 to 100 basis point jump in the 10-year yield that's a huge move.
It's devastating. The 10-year yield would spike to somewhere between 4.8 and 5.3%. That extra 75 to 100 basis points is a risk premium. It's the extra price investors demand just to lend money to the U.S. government because they don't trust its institutions anymore. And that risk premium flows through the entire economy. Mortgage rates, car loans, business loans, everything gets more expensive overnight. The political risk becomes a real cost in your wallet.
And the ultimate threat goes beyond our own economy to the U.S. dollar's role in the world.
That's long-term structural damage. The sources warn this kind of crisis could trigger a real challenge to dollar dominance. The dollar could fall by 4 to 8% as global investors run for safety. When your central bank is no longer seen as reliable, your currency isn't either. And you'd see capital flight to alternatives gold, the Swiss franc assets that are seen as politically neutral.
So given those stakes, what do the sources recommend to stop this severe scenario from actually happening?
The first priority has to be Congress, building institutional firewalls. And fast. That means legislation to explicitly prohibit criminal probes of Fed officials for their official actions, unless there's clear evidence of corruption. And they need to strengthen those for-cause removal standards to protect governors from being fired for political reasons.
And what about reassuring the rest of the world?
That's a diplomatic full-court press. The Treasury and the Fed need to be in constant contact with foreign central banks and finance ministries. They have to reassure them that U.S. institutions are resilient, that this is temporary chaos. Holding on to dollar dominance requires a credible commitment to quality institutions. And that commitment needs to be shouted from the rooftops right now. In the end, it really boils down to this. The sources show that preserving the Fed's independence has to be the top priority. It has to come before any short-term political goals, because the costs of damaging that institution, a huge risk premium on all your borrowing, global capital flight, unstable inflation, those costs vastly exceed any tiny benefit you might get from a politically obedient monetary policy.
So you've seen how institutional risk is now the single biggest factor in the U.S. economic outlook. If the country continues down this path, with the Supreme Court case looming and the political pressure mounting, you have to ask yourself, how quickly could the world really move away from the dollar as its primary currency? And what would that cost every single American household? That's the real cost of political brinkmanship that we all need to be thinking about now. That's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.